Goodness. It's interesting. I'm sitting here and I can see over my shoulder the Buddha. And that Buddha actually came from Buddhafield. The last time I was there, I bought it in the Buddhafield shop. And goodness, it's nice to have that reminder. All the time that I've been going to do this talk, I've been really aware of the fact that we would be here in this space online rather than in the tent as usual. And yet at the same time, I've had the image of the tent. I've had the image of being there in the middle of the field, talking with all of you. And it's so interesting how these different kinds of images are there in parallel. You know, we can hold different worlds. We can be aware of different worlds in our consciousness, and yet we can be in one particular one. So I'd like to invite you now at the start of this talk to just sit quietly for a few minutes and to just take yourself back. First of all, just feel yourself sitting in the space that you're in now. Feel the seat that you're sitting on. Feel the room that you're in and have a sense of the kind of space that it creates, the walls around you, the furniture, and so on and so forth. And then just going back in your memory to a year ago. Where were you this time last year? How was your world this time last year? Imagine yourself in a space that you occupied this time last year. Notice what's around you. Notice the place, buildings if there are buildings, grass, trees, tents, whatever. Imagine the people. Imagine what you're doing, what your concerns are. And then at the same time, hold this other world, this world of the now. Looking across the divide of a year of time and space. How is it different? Breathe into the now and notice what you experience as you do so. Okay, and I'd like now to invite you to open your eyes, to come into the space, to experience here now on the screen. to notice what you see. How have things changed? This day last year, I was in Japan. I was taking ordination. Hard to think back, so many people, all crowded into a temple in Kyoto. So different. Traveling freely. The moral concern I had about flying, and yet I needed to go there to do the ordination. Walking the streets, going into shops, going into buildings, getting on trains. It's a different world. Okay, so I would like to talk to you today about some of that change, and I'm going to share with you some of my experiences, my sense of some of what's unfolded over the last year, or even the last 6 months, relating it to Buddhist psychology. What can we learn from it? What has this COVID crisis taught us? Have we learned anything? Last October, I was in Trafalgar Square. I was sitting with other Buddhists in the Extinction Rebellion protests. We were fired by our concerns, our anxieties, our grief for the planet, our desperation to do something, to be seen, to speak out. When I first thought of doing this talk, I imagined that I would be talking about climate, about environmentalism, about some of the issues that are facing us. I didn't know that things would start to change. None of us did. But in November, something happened in the world. Something happened in Wuhan. And by February, in Europe, we were starting to see the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Wuhan had been a long way away. Italy seemed a lot closer. I remember watching the news items on it. The sense of panic, the terror, the dreadful scenes of people on trolleys in corridors, the coffins, people dressed in suits and masks, a terrifying, different kind of world that we'd never known before. And so February unfolded. In February, I travelled across Europe. I went to Poland to give some teaching. I travelled by train across Belgium, Germany, into Poland. Crowds everywhere. I remember a kind of mild anxiety, but at the time it seemed like as long as we stayed away from people who'd come from China or Italy, we were probably all right. It was March when things started to change. I remember in March having a conversation with one of our students who was due to come from Italy to a course, and hoping and discussing that maybe it was not a good idea. And only a week later, wondering whether we should be running the course at all. This picture is my mother in a nursing home where she lives locally to me. I used to visit her every day, and this was the last day that I visited her. I've only seen her once since that occasion in person, and that was this week. And it was through a window with just a crack open so that we could try to talk to each other. Though both of us have bad hearing, so it was not an easy conversation, but absolutely delightful. Things changed. Suddenly, things changed. Suddenly, mid-March, we were in lockdown. People spoke of coronavirus. It wasn't even called COVID in those days. Seems like such a long time ago now. There was fear, there was chaos, there was confusion. Massive hospitals were prepared. We all waited, not knowing what was going to happen. We saw the images coming from Italy and other European countries. We saw the spread, we heard the daily figures. The deaths mounted from single figures to double figures to triple figures. People started panic buying. The supermarkets were stripped bare. Other people didn't want to know, didn't believe it. Conspiracy theories, ideas that this was just some ruse that was being developed. These ideas are still around. This week we had reports of somebody in Texas who died after attending a COVID party because he thought that the virus was a hoax. I believe some of his last words were, "I think I made a dreadful mistake." We changed our habits. We started to be frugal and careful. We prepared for a siege. People went into their cupboards. They found things they hadn't used for years. There were discussions on the radio. Could you use a tin of beans that was 10 years old, or a jar of sauce? People brought out the things that they hadn't used and used them. Some of these things we laughed at. Home haircuts, people going grey, people wearing their pajamas during the day. We joked about how we would look when we came out of lockdown, how we'd learned to go feral, stop shaving our legs, get untidy, not do our nails or our hair, not change our clothes so often. There were also around at that time a lot of ideas about maybe this wasn't such a bad thing. You know, I think particularly because I was moving in circles with environmentalists, I saw a lot of utopian ideas put out there. People saw that maybe this could be a new era that was coming. The virus had been serious enough to shake up the world. It had evoked great change, and maybe this could be for the good. Nature was taking revenge. Perhaps humans would see the sense in this. Perhaps they would understand that they had to live in harmony with the ecosystem. Perhaps from this, there would be learning that could be the salvation of the planet. Perhaps people would see that as they lived more frugal lives, actually they were happier. Perhaps they would see that as we stopped driving places, as we stopped using aeroplanes and so on, that all the pollution levels were dropping. Perhaps they would want to continue this. Perhaps the green agenda would actually come to the fore. There was a lot of hope around, as well as the anxiety. And for myself, I spent a lot of time in the garden. I spent a lot of time living in the moment. You know, particularly back in those early days in March. It was beautifully sunny. And we were just so lucky because I live in a Buddhist center, but we had no visitors. We were closed to the public. There were just two of us living here, myself and my partner, and we could just enjoy the whole house and the garden. We felt no great need to go beyond. Present moment, wonderful moment, to quote Thich Nhat Hanh. And we could enjoy the plants, we could enjoy the sunshine, we could enjoy the birds, we could enjoy the animals. We've had hedgehogs in the garden and we feed them every night. There's something about stopping that allows you to see the flowers and the cracks in the pavement. When things slow down, then it's like we're able to appreciate the small things in life. We're not rushing so much. And the skies were clear and blue. There were no vapor trails. It was so noticeable, the difference. People talked of hearing birdsong in the cities, holding to nothing whatsoever. It's like in these moments, there's a calm. I remember maybe 30 years ago now, if I think about it, going on a via ferrata in the French Alps. This is like a rope walk where you go along a cliff face. And I have an absolute terror of heights. But because I was leading a group and the group wanted to do it, and we had a mountain leader with us who was prepared to take us, I had to go along with this. And so I summoned up my courage and I did this cliff face walk. And what I learned from it was that actually, although I am terrified of heights, I was terrified climbing up. I was terrified climbing down. But as we walked along on the narrow ledges and sometimes just clinging to the rock face with the rope, actually I could rest and enjoy the view. I could actually feel at peace with my fears. In those moments when everything else stops, whatever the fear, whatever the danger, there is some kind of peace that comes. The Buddha talked a lot about impermanence. We've been living in times of impermanence. We've discovered that so much that we took for granted actually is just fragile. So much that we take for granted it just disappears. Impermanence is enshrined in the first noble truth, the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress and despair are dukkha. Association with what is not loved is dukkha, and separated from what is loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. Affliction, suffering, impermanence, they're all there. They're all part of life. And as we watched these scenes, we saw our own mortality. We could be that person on the bed. Our loved ones could be that person on the bed. People died alone, in isolation. Every night on the news we contemplated sickness, old age, death. These are the contemplations that the monks did in the days of the Buddha. They're formalized in the charnel ground meditations. You find them in the Satipatthana Sutta. The monks would go and they would sit in the charnel grounds and they would watch the bodies decomposing in all their different stages. They would contemplate impermanence, mortality. They would contemplate their own vulnerability. They would be faced by change. This is what we have faced. This is what we are still facing. Uncertainty, change. So you should view this fleeting world, a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom and a dream. This is the Diamond Sutta. Life, just a bubble. So easy to burst. An illusion. And so, how do we react to this reality? As we've already said, I teach Buddhist psychology and Buddhist psychotherapy. And when we look at the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, we see in the teaching of Samudaya, the second noble truth, there is a pattern described, the ways that we deal with our fears, the ways in which we avoid affliction. Kama, sensory attachment. Bhava, becoming a person, creating an identity. Vibhava, non-becoming, seeking oblivion and depression. And if we think of our own behavior during the crisis, what have we done? What have we clung to? Some people have taken to drink, others to food, all kinds of attachment. First of all, it's simply a sensory attachment, a distraction. We feel anxiety and we reach for something to comfort ourselves. But soon it builds, it becomes an identity. It becomes our habit pattern. it becomes something that recurs. The beer cans mount up. The bottles fill the recycling. We put on weight. And then when it all becomes too much, we want to find oblivion. We sink into a pit. We pull the duvet over our head. We try to disappear. Some people fall into consumption. Some people go the other way and put their energy into blaming and anger. These are the patterns of attachment. Greed attachments, hate attachment. We blame people, we blame others. We blame people other than ourselves out of our worlds. And while this is going on, we struggle because the identities that we have created in the past don't work for us. Most of the time in life, we create identities out of the various props and surroundings that make up the backdrop of our existence, particularly things like work, relationships, friendships, going to places, our favorite cafe, our favorite pub, our favorite cinema. All of these things disappear. Under lockdown, we became divorced from a lot of these props to our identity, and we had to create new ones. Who am I when I'm not working? Who can I be? Do I disappear? Do I fall into that oblivion of vibhava? Some of us, of course, create new online enterprises. Some of us forge new identities out of the crisis. It's been an interesting process. I think for myself, during the first weeks, I spent a lot of time sitting in the garden, and then I became incredibly busy because all of our courses that we teach here, they all had to go online. I had to completely reinvent everything that I did. I had to learn to teach on Zoom. I had to learn to use PowerPoints, something that I very rarely do normally. I had to respond to people in different ways. I had to take my client work onto the computer. Everything had to change. And so some people forged new identities in the process of lockdown. We create bubbles for ourselves. This is another bit of Buddhist psychology here. When we live in a scary world, we create psychological bubbles through the various cycles that are described in the Buddhist teachings. This is the cycle of the skandhas. It's very similar to the cycle of dependent origination, but rather simpler. We see things in a conditioned way. We react to them. We build our associations with them. We create mental formations out of those. And as we act, we build those samskaras. This contributes to vijnana, the ordinary consciousness, which leads us to go out looking for more things that fit with our conditioned view of the world. And so we see the world in a habitual way, we respond to it in a habitual way, We build it into the stories that we already have about the world through the process of association. We then build more traces in our minds. We build the ordinary consciousness, which leads us to view things in a conditioned way. This is the psychological bubble that we inhabit. It's a bubble that relies on surrounding ourselves by the familiar. It's a bubble that relies on us recreating the old world all of the time, rebuilding that attachment that has kept us going all our lives, the attachment to our sense of self. And so the bubble of identity protects us from the world and maintains the status quo. And as the pandemic has unfolded, we create new bubbles, new stories for our lives, new stories that reinforce our identity. It's a bit like the algorithm. We surround ourselves just by the things that are familiar, that tell us that the world is unchanging and keep us safe. We all feel comforted by living within our own algorithms, holding to nothing whatsoever. What happens if we let the bubble go? What happens if we break out of the algorithm and see the world in different terms? One of the things that we have discovered during this pandemic has been our interconnectedness. We are not separate, but part of the greater web of life. This is the image of Indra's net. Indra's net stretches across the universe, infinitely in all directions. At all of the intersections in the net, there are jewels, and each jewel reflects every other jewel. And so we live in an interconnected system. COVID has taught us that we are not separate. We are not separate from the animal species. This virus came from animals. It came from the destruction of habitation of wildlife. It came from humans mistreating the animals. It came from the consumption of animals that should never have been eaten. And we are interconnected through our international global system, through the level of travel, people moving between China and Europe and the States, and indeed all the continents of the world. The virus spreads as we spread. Sometimes the image of the virus is used to describe humans. Now it is us or the virus in a deathly competition. And so the web of life interconnects us, and we discover that we cannot live as separate beings. We discover that we have effects on others. You know, these recent conflicts over masks, people asserting that it's their freedom of choice. And yet, if my neighbour refuses to wear a mask and has the disease, then the disease comes in my direction. And likewise, if I have the disease and do not wear the mask, I give it to you. We discover our responsibility to one another in this system, that we are interconnected, that we share the same air, that we breathe the same germs, that we experience the same surroundings, the same conditions, that support or cause problems in our lives. We discovered the importance of human contact, family. The separation is hard. You know, I talked about my mother earlier. It has been so difficult, even though we've been lucky enough to have FaceTime connection and be able to speak most days. It's still not the same thing. We discovered community and our reliance on so many people who often we don't even think about. I guess the NHS has always had a good press, but how many of us before have thought about supermarket operators and delivery men and postmen and so on and so forth? You know, there are so many people who have gone out to work and taken risks on our behalf. And we discovered that we are part of a bigger story. We're part of history. You know, these changing times, they'll be remembered and recorded. We're part of it. And we discovered that we are part of the ecosystem, that what we do, what we destroy, it has effect. And here I just want to remind us of Thich Nhat Hanh's coining of the word into being, our absolute dependence on one another and on all other aspects of life. The way that he talked about how even when you look at a sheet of paper, you can see that a cloud is floating in it, because without the cloud, there would be no rain. Without rain, no trees would grow, and without trees, there would be no paper. Holding to nothing whatsoever. We cannot exist without the conditions of our lives, without our connections to one another. Change the conditions, you change everything. But craving doesn't go away. We stand at the windows looking out at the world, and the craving to be part of it, to connect, it arises again. As lockdown eases, we long to get back to normal. But what was normal? What normals do we want? These shells that we create, these bubbles, they're collective. What kind of world do we want to inhabit? We talk about the new normal. We want stability. We want to connect. We want to regain control and get on with our lives. The new normal, the new bubble. Humans are desperate to put structures in place that will hold them, that will give them the illusion of permanence, even though impermanence is evident and all around them. We talk about social bubbles. Ironic, really. We want to rebuild the economy. If you can work from home, do so. This was the message early on. Now, if you can go back to work, please do. It's not simple. There are no simple answers. You know, I think the ideas of everything changing, those kind of utopian dreams that were around early on in the pandemic, it's very evident that actually it's not that simple. Those of us who can manage during the lockdown, we're safe, we're fine. But so many people's livelihoods are at stake. I can rail against the prioritizing of the economy, but at the same time, people's lives are being wrecked because their businesses are going out of action. They're losing their incomes, they're losing their jobs. It's not simple. There are not straightforward answers because we're all interconnected. Our society is built on these economic connections. People who don't go out to work don't need the same things. They don't need transport to anything like the same degree. They don't buy fast food and snacks. They don't have a drink on the way home. They don't buy new outfits for work. They don't have their hair done as often. They don't impulse buy things when they're walking around town. They don't spend as much money. It's so interesting, you know, our whole economic system. It's becoming very evident that it's founded on people, in a way, spending in order to make work, in order for people to spend. And it relies on this unnecessary spending. You know, I think it's become very evident to me during this pandemic, if it wasn't before, that a lot of our environmental problems are actually based on this kind of economic system. But what do you do about it when so many people's livelihoods depend on it? You know, I can be smug and sit at home and say, I'm not buying the food, I'm not buying the drinks, I'm not having my hair done, I'm not using public transport. But at the same time, the people who I would be buying those things from, those services from, they're not receiving the money. They have to struggle. They might be out of work and so on. You know, how do we exist in our lives without troubling others in different ways? But of course, you know, when people are not going out to work, they're not using the fossil fuels. And ultimately, this is what the planet needs. You know, I think some kind of shift to more home working and so on. In a way, it's wonderful that it's been demonstrated how possible that is and the savings that have come about through it. But I think we need to be careful about how we think about making changes in that direction so that we safeguard the people who are going to be disadvantaged by it. But in the short run, you know, I think the government and others are looking to consumption as being the way out of the problem. And this works on the social level, the economic level, but also on the personal level. You know, these were the queues when the shops opened. People there on the first day when it became possible to go and buy clothes and so on, they were queuing outside Primark. And at the same time, people have become much more concerned about their national interests. The borders have closed, partly for health reasons, but also because we're looking after our own. It's been a time of making trade deals. It's been a time of political maneuvering. Who's in bed with who? Who's going to form which social bubble? We've formed economic and national bubbles. And so these processes that we talk about in Buddhist psychology, they happen not just on the individual level, but on the collective level. We don't just form selves as individuals, we form selves as communities, as countries. And a lot of it's on the back of some people profiting from the losses of others. This is pictures of what's been going on in Leicester with the sweatshops, which have been shown to be feeding the fashion industry, and particularly the scandal around Boohoo and the way that those clothes were being made in back streets by people who are often on wages way below the minimum wage, working in very cramped conditions. It's all backfired now, and in Leicester we're in lockdown again, or at least we're not because we're just outside it, but Leicester itself is in lockdown at the moment. And this is very much a product of these kinds of bad circumstances, which are the dark side of our economic advances and our economic well-being. Holding to nothing whatsoever. What would society be like if we didn't go through these processes, if we didn't rebuild our economy? How is it going to be? How are we going to face the future if all of our economic activity falls. And what could the world be like beyond the clinging, beyond the attachment? Can we find something else that's not just a utopian fantasy? How can we build solid change on what we've experienced? I think Buddhism has a lot to say about speaking up. We can borrow the phrase from the Quakers, speaking truth to power. I think Buddhist practice is really a practice of deep honesty, looking into ourselves, looking into our society, being deeply honest about the way that we crave, the way that we attach, the way that we are greedy, the way that we hate. These are human characteristics, but we need to face them, and we need to challenge and speak out. And at the same time, we need to not get stuck in attachment to views or attachment to being seen as being good. We need to be willing to risk thinking the unthinkable. We need to be able to see every side. One of the things that we have learnt from this is who we value and what we value. We've come to appreciate, as I said earlier, a lot of the people who were forgotten in society. We haven't been standing on our doorsteps clapping the bankers. We've been standing there clapping the bin men, the care workers, the nursing staff, the people who've kept life going. And we've learnt to value family and those connections that have often been very difficult in the lockdown period. And we can wonder what the world would look like if we didn't consume as much as we've been used to doing. Could we have a different economic vision? What might it look like? Holding to nothing whatsoever. What could be possible? What could change? We don't know what is coming. I picked up this series of cartoons this morning on Facebook from somebody, and I had to put them into my PowerPoint. We start with COVID. And on its tail, we see the recession looming. We're frightened by the recession. But behind the recession, there's another wave, climate change. And behind that wave of climate change, the collapse of biodiversity. How will that be? And how has what we've been through prepared us for these catastrophic changes that are going to happen in the planet, probably in all of our lifetimes? If it's been difficult in lockdown, what's it going to be like when climate changes? And if we were unprepared for COVID, then can we be prepared? Can we make the necessary changes, the necessary provisions for climate change? How will we respond to the crisis? What will we take refuge in? In the early days of the pandemic, we were perhaps naive in thinking that change could be this fast. Despite the fear, perhaps because of it, we had visions of a utopian future in which planes no longer filled the skies, and we were surrounded by a community of people who cared. The months after have shown that, in fact, the majority of people are highly attached to their ordinary lives, and normal is what we all crave. This normal is the culmination of our conditioned thinking and the actions over many years. It's no more substantive than a bubble in the stream, and yet we seek it out. This is not the whole story, however, for ideals and values have real consequences. In our current economic system, the people who suffer from the loss of work and livelihood are often the least able to find sources for survival. Our system has eroded its social care and communitarian aspects over the last decades, and we are floundering in the values of self-interest and individualism. So it is that the economic changes and the building of the future that is good for the planet and good for our ecosystem demands more than simple reductions. It's not just a matter of using less. It demands a complete rethinking of our values. In the face of COVID, perhaps we can reappraise these values, but the signs are that for many of us, this is not happening. Those of us who do hold to other values must keep speaking out with courage, upholding lifestyles that are kinder and indeed less heavy on the ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you so much to everyone in the space for the attention that you've all been giving the talk. If anyone would like to ask questions, then please let us know by clicking on participants and then clicking raise your hands. And I'll unmute each person in turn to ask their questions to Caroline or sort of say what they would like to share. Thank you. And if it's all right with you, Caroline, we can take questions until maybe 8:10. Yes,
that's fine, yes. I suppose I have a question. I'd be interested to know whether people here have similar experiences, you know, what their sense of lockdown was, what conclusions they're drawing from it as well. I think we have a question. Is that right?
Yes, and we have a question. We have a question from Kamala D on the group chat. How to stay positive in the face of such challenge?
I think it's tough. And you know, I think there are different things. In Buddhism, we have sudden path and gradual path methods. And I think a lot of the gradual path methods are about building a kind of bubble around ourselves that is healthy and that is positive. And so I think when we're facing a crisis like this, then finding ways to enhance our lives and create some sense of stability using things which are going to be for the good. I think these are ways of staying positive. So, you know, this may be very simple. You know, we've seen a lot of people getting involved in community action during lockdown. And we can kind of step back from this and say, well, you know, maybe that's not doing so much good, or maybe they're just investing their egos in it, or maybe it's futile, or whatever it is. But you know, if you're doing something that helps other people, that itself gives you a kind of positive sense yourself, and that's fine. You know, we're not perfect beings. We benefit from these things. So, you know, I think there are things we can do which are around finding small meaning in our lives. I think there's also things we can do around appreciation. You know, I talked about looking in the cracks in the pavement and seeing the plants growing there. And, you know, I think, well, this itself is a lovely exercise to do. I've just been running an ecotherapy photography course online. And one of the exercises I gave people to do was to go out and photograph all the plants growing in the pavements around them. And just looking at the way that life comes back in the pavements, because of course there's a great symbolism in this, as well as the sort of practicality. It's got kind of all levels in it. But that kind of going out and looking at the wonderful things that are going on just in our immediate vicinity, focusing on those, giving our attention to those. I think these are things that give us heart. And then, of course, our practice. You know, our practice connects us to something bigger than ourselves. And however we want to construe it, that connection to the other, to the whole, to Buddha, to enlightened beingness, that connection, that's really what can hold us. So, you know, I think there are different levels to this. There's the creating the positive self, if you like, the positive identity. There's the reaching out, and there's this sort of present moment, small scale appreciation. I think those are all ways in which you can hold to something during this crisis, so that you're kind of anchoring yourself. Because most of us are not ready to just float free into the terror kind of thing.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I really liked your talk, and I was thinking about the planes, because I've actually felt so much better not hearing the noise of aircraft. But that is a bit, actually, that doesn't make me a nice person, because there are going to be lots of people who are going to have their livelihoods taken away because of that. But I still can't feel too bad about it, because I so enjoy the peace. Do you feel the same?
Oh, very much so, yes. And I think it's one of these dilemmas. You know, when I say things are much more complex than we might think at first, you know, I mean, I've relished having clear skies and no planes, and I've felt really quite a kind of personal hurt when I've started to see planes going across again. And a lot of that's the environmental concern, you know. I mean, flying is one of the worst things environmentally. And as I said at the beginning, I had to fly to get to Japan to do my ordination, but it was a real sort of moral question for me whether I should go or not. But I decided to in the end. But, you know, it's like, yes, in an ideal world, it would be wonderful if we didn't fly everywhere. If we could reduce the amount of flying, so much the better. And I'm hoping that with all this online communication, we've actually discovered that maybe we don't need to fly as many places as we used to. And maybe we're actually quite happy to just go down the road when we want a change of scene, rather than kind of needing to jet off somewhere far away and so on. So, you know, I hope that there will be learning that will reduce the amount of flying that goes on. But I also completely appreciate that, you know, it is people's livelihoods, it's people's holidays, it's the way people who've got family in other countries see them. You know, I know many people who've got relatives living far too far away for them to be able to even go by train. And, you know, train is not the answer to everything. I went to Warsaw by train in February, and it was a 2-day journey to get there and 2 days to get back. And there was a bit of me going, you're absolutely mad. Why didn't you just get on a plane? And another bit of me going, I'm not going to get on a plane. I'm going to show everyone I can do it by train. Kind of thing. So, you know, it's not simple, and I appreciate that. But I think if we can reduce these things, then that's wonderful. But I think we always have to have in mind that there's always another side of the coin. And we have to have that concern and that care for the person who is being hurt by whatever change we're making. You know. And at the same time, society does have to move on, and there are going to have to be changes. And environmentally, like it or not, we are going to have to either change the way that we behave and, you know, make these big changes in lifestyle and so on, or else we're going to be faced with such a disaster that it's going to change it for us. Anyway, I can see there are a lot of hands up, so I'll try.
I kind of wanted to offer, I could partially answer to your question, Caroline. I think one of the things I experienced being in lockdown, and I was first time in my life in a very lucky position to be in the countryside and have a lot of access out and in a garden, and being basically out from everything. I didn't watch news. I was just really in my little world doing my own healing. So for me, it was a massive gift personally, even if financially I've been affected and all that, but I experienced loads of amazingness coming out of this situation. And I know it's a very personal experience. We've been all in the same storm, but in a very different boats. So yeah, for me, one of the biggest gifts as the whole society is we had to start thinking differently. We had to rekindle or kind of discover different way of creativity to be able to respond on the situation in short term, also in long term. And I think that is a massive gift, that because I believe in social change and I want a social change as well as spiritual, there's a lot of things. If we can't think creatively and feel creatively or practically do things differently, there is no way for social change. And therefore I feel this was kind of a taster or like a starter before a big main course. What can we do if we have to? And I hope a lot of amazing ideas could have come out with, because as we shift something in our system to think and feel and act differently, even though it's going to be painful. And that is really important for me to also say, like, a lot of jobs which are existing in the current world are absolutely unsustainable, and of course no one should be impacted by it. So what we can do, that people can find different ways how to support their living without damaging themselves, others, or the planet. Thank you.
I mean, I think one of the things that's come out of this, as well as all the troubles that have come out of it, has been the creativity. It's been amazing, the sort of release of creativity that we've had during this crisis, and people coming up with new ways of being, new lifestyles and so on. And I think we need to harness this. And I would like to see a future in which we think about what we need as a society and we put that in place rather than just going back to the old. I think there's a huge opportunity in this. Yes, thank you.
And so we've got 3 questions, Angie, Sean and Scylla Davey. So next question is from Angie.
Hi, thank you, great talk, really enjoyed it. And it just kind of struck me that there's such a great sadness and anxiety around with the current crisis, but also a huge potential for insight and an opportunity. And I've heard this time called the Great Pause, and I really love what you were just saying then. It really feels like an opportunity to do something different, and I just wondered whether you thought this opportunity for insight was going to go beyond the realm of people interested in Buddhism. Do you think there's a bigger picture that people are beginning to see?
I hope so. I don't know. I mean, I see both positive and not so positive things going on. I see this huge rush to kind of get back to normal and kind of open up all the worst kind of things in terms of, I don't know. No, that's just my prejudice. I shan't go off on that one. But, I see the very difficult trends going on, and also I see very positive things happening. So I think both things are there. But I would like to see more leadership from government and others who are in charge in terms of building something positive for the future. I think in some ways there's a missed opportunity there, because this is a time when we could be rethinking. It's a time when we could be, for instance, redesigning education. I would have liked to have seen a lot more thought going into how do we educate this generation of children who have had to spend all these months at home homeschooling, and how do we deal with that creatively and put in creative things in place for those children from disadvantaged families who maybe don't have access to a laptop and all the sort of paraphernalia of middle class kids and so on. So, I think there are a lot of missed opportunities here that I would have liked seeing happening. And I'm worried that things like the arts are going to go in decline, and, we're going to lose a lot socially from it. But I think also there are a lot of good things that have come out of it, and I'd like to see that potential built on.
I was going to say, I just work in the charitable sector, and we have there's both fragility and agility. So some charities have really responded to new ways of working and responding to changing needs really well, but equally some are really struggling.
Yes, well, I think that's right. And I mean, our own experience, I mean, here at Tariki, we realized that the courses that we were running were all attendance courses. People were used to coming to the house here, and suddenly we couldn't do that anymore, and it's just about impossible to socially distance in this house. So we had to go online, and suddenly we were able to offer a lot of different courses, different people running them, without anyone needing to travel around the country, and people have been able to access them who weren't able to come here previously. So there's been a whole lot of things have opened up in that respect. So yes, I think it's a matter of you have to think out the box and be creative with these things.
I just was unmuted, so I guess my name is Sean. I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts, in the U.S. And I just want to ask, to put it out there, a question or thought-provoking statement about some people like Jim Bendel have been talking about the collapse of ideologies, the collapse of narrative. And I'm wondering, first I was thinking about like the way that the lockdown forced everybody to do what we would normally consider spiritual, like go inside, stay in, shut everything off, don't go shopping, don't run into all the usual thing, your usual routine, completely disrupted. And so you have to go inside and start asking some questions about like even existential questions like, why am I here? Am I going to die soon? You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. And so is it possible, do you think, for people of any persuasion or any faith or no faith at all to have a spiritual experience from a situation like this? And maybe is one of the manifestations of that not a technological change, but a change of consciousness, right? Collapse of the narrative, collapse of ideology, which seems to me has to precede any fundamental change in the technology or how we arrange ourselves socially.
There's a lot in what you've just said.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one thing I would say is that humans are very good at rebuilding narratives. And the fact that they are locked away in their houses doesn't necessarily mean that they think particularly deeply, that we're just as good as escaping and building identities and so on within four walls as we are when we're in society. But certainly there's been a disruption, and I think that has the potential for spiritual change. And I would also like to say that I don't think that spiritual experience is limited to people who are pursuing spiritual experience. I think people can have that kind of insight from this kind of situation, and they may not even give it a spiritual label, but I think it's still there. And equally, I think people who are pursuing spiritual experience can end up just staying in the same old rut, because that itself can become a narrative and a story and a box that we live in. So yes, I mean, this kind of thing, it shakes the foundations of our lives, and our tendency then is either to get out of the box or to create another box even faster that's even firmer. So it can go either way. But yeah, I mean, spiritual change, spiritual insight, it can happen to anyone, anywhere. And in these kind of circumstances where the rug's pulled away, you know, there is an opening. And if people are able to take that opening, whether they frame it in terms of spiritual language or whether they frame it in other ways, I think that's quite possible, yes.
Oh, hi Caroline. So I've just been let know that unfortunately the virtual tent is going to have to close soon, because the next group will be waiting to come in.
Yes.
So normally we'd say, you know, please head out to the parasol and further discussion and questions under the tree. For now, we'll say back over on Facebook. And yeah, thank you so much to Caroline for your talk, and to everyone else for joining us, and yeah, look forward to seeing you at other events over the course of the weekend.